14 years ago this week, on June 25th, 2007, the biggest tragedy in the history of the wrestling business makes mainstream news as the bodies of Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel are discovered in their home by the Fayetteville County Sheriff's Department in Georgia. They were prompted by WWE officials to do a wellness check, which is why they discovered the bodies. Benoit had no-showed the Vengeance Night of Champions pay-per-view the night before, where he was scheduled to wrestle for, and I believe win, the vacant ECW championship against CM Punk. It was very unlike Benoit to no-show an appearance, especially on a live pay-per-view, because he had told people days earlier that Nancy and Daniel were sick, and he had to rush home. It's chilling just thinking back to the idea that this is what he was telling people. Like, he knew, but this is what he was telling people. His body was found hanging from a pulley, using a cord from his weight machine as a noose around his neck, which is not a pleasant way to take one's life. I would not imagine. Nancy's body was found wrapped in a towel with her hands and feet bound. She had been strangled and very badly beaten. Their son was also asphyxiated, found in his bedroom. Both had Bibles placed next to their bodies, and Benoit was not the religious type, but they both had Bibles beside them. It was later determined that Benoit killed his wife and son and then himself in a double murder-suicide. The killings happened over a 3-day period that weekend, with Nancy first being killed on Friday, Daniel being killed on Saturday, and then Benoit killing himself on Sunday, but not before trying, even after he had just killed 2 people, to book a flight to get to Texas for the pay-per-view. He was trying to make the show, or at least thinking about trying to make the show. The thought of him actually going through with it, you imagine if he flew in for the pay-per-view and wrestled with his family dead at home? It's horrifying. Nancy's sister, Sandra, said that the medical examiner told the family that Chris would very likely have been dead anyway within 10 months. His heart was 3 times the normal size, was ready to blow up at any moment. She blames steroids and prescription drugs for him doing what he did. In fact, there's a photo of Benoit in Dr. Phil Aston's office the same day that he killed Nancy, just hours before. Aston said that he had prescribed testosterone for Benoit. Aston's office was later raided, and he admitted to illegally prescribing drugs many times without even examining his patients first, and pleaded guilty to all 175 counts against him before being sentenced to 10 years in prison. Tests concluded that Benoit's brain was so riddled with CTE, it looked like the brain of an 80-year-old Alzheimer's patient. The same day the bodies were discovered, WWE was to have presented a tribute to Mr. McMahon during a 3-hour edition of Monday Night Raw. This was after the limo explosion angle. They even flew in Vince's brother, Rod. Rod McMahon was going to make his first ever appearance on WWE television, but for obvious reasons, the show was canceled, and they scrapped the entire angle. Fans were greeted instead when they tuned into USA Network by Vince McMahon standing in the middle of the ring in an empty arena, letting everybody know what had happened, and that instead they would be paying tribute to the life and career of Chris Benoit. By the next day, once it was clear, it was clear later that night, but by the next day, once it was clear what had likely happened here, Vince McMahon's tune changed, and he opened that night's episode of ECW on Sci-Fi with a very different statement, that there would be no mentions of Chris Benoit, and in fact, his name has never been mentioned again on WWE television in the 14 years since. And the fact that you still occasionally, it doesn't happen a lot, thankfully, but the fact that you still, even occasionally, have people asking if Chris Benoit is ever going to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. You know, I hear Jim Ross even And other people in wrestling on their podcasts will talk about how they get asked on Twitter and stuff. Oh, when will Chris Benoit go into the Hall of Fame? If enough time has gone by, will Chris Benoit be inducted into the Hall of Fame? Or even suggesting that they want to see him inducted into the Hall of Fame. All that shows is that Benoit is not the only one here suffering from brain damage. I remember exactly where I was when I learned of the news. I'm sure a lot of you probably remember as well. I was at work. I was getting ready to leave to go home to watch Raw, to watch this funeral, this memorial service for Vince McMahon. And right before I left the office, I went, it must have been either the Observer site or PW Insider, one of those sites. And there it was, staring me right back in the face, in the headline. Chris Benoit and family found dead. And my jaw dropped. I clicked on the story and I could not believe what I was reading. I was just sitting there in just stunned silence for 20 or 30 seconds. It didn't seem real. And my first thought, once I processed the news and I realized, oh my God, this is a real story. Honest to God, the first thought that ran through my head was not murder-suicide. It was not that even the family was, burglarized and they were all slaughtered or anything like that. The first thing I thought of, because you hear about stories like this sometimes, I thought it was carbon monoxide poisoning. I thought the family was home. They either didn't have an alarm or it didn't go off. There was a leak. And they all, died in their sleep. I couldn't even conceive of the idea that it was a murder-suicide type of situation. And I didn't even know Benoit, so imagine how his friends and colleagues felt when they got the news. People who knew him, people who maybe knew his family or had met his wife or his son before. I mean, it was the most shocking thing that I had ever heard about in all my years of being a wrestling fan. And it was a turning point for the company that really forced them to shore up their wellness policy, which had more holes in it than Swiss cheese. I mean, they implemented it after Eddie Guerrero passed away, and it was better than nothing. It was a good program, but it was not as strong, not nearly as strong as it is today. Once the Benoit stuff happened, that's when it felt like that's really when they got super serious about it. And even now, it's not a perfect system, I'm sure. But this is what really got them to kind of get their act together and say, okay, we've got to start taking this shit seriously. The following year, the company went PG. They banned chair shots to the head. They banned choking. I mean, it was a huge black eye for the wrestling business and for WWE, especially the way that some of the talent responded. They would send out talent for interviews on these cable TV shows. This is when Nancy Disgrace and all those other fucking losers were having wrestlers on their shows every night just to try to pop a rating. They knew nothing about wrestling, so to hear them talk about it, and then, for example, was it Nancy Disgrace? I forgot who it was. They had, I think it was her. They had the list. They had the list of all the wrestlers, all the young wrestlers that passed away in their 30s and their 40s, their early 50s, from steroids and drugs and heart attacks. But I'm looking at this list, and you had people on that list like Owen Hart. And I think they lumped in a bunch of other names too. It's like, the moment that you've lumped in Owen Hart on that list, on a list that is meant to show drug deaths and things of that nature, you've instantly lost all credibility. They had an intern go on the internet and put together a list of all the dead wrestlers and give it to me. But this was going on every night for weeks. It was like a fucking circus. But a lot of the guys who went on television, and Ken Kennedy was one of them, did not exactly make themselves look good in their appearances. And as more information came out about some of the stuff that Benoit was doing and the drugs and the steroids and stuff, again, it was just a huge black eye for the company, huge black eye for the industry. And I don't care, how good of a wrestler Chris Benoit was, or what drugs he was taking. Drugs, by the way, that he chose to take. Nobody forced them down his throat. Nobody forced those needles into his ass. He made that choice. His wife and son were not given a choice. He killed 2 people in brutal fashion, especially his wife. Her injuries were horrific. And it's still hard to reconcile, all these years later, how any of this could have happened. 13 years ago this week, on June 23rd, 2008, WWE hosted its draft lottery on Monday Night Raw from San Antonio, Texas. The biggest move being Triple H, who was WWE champion at the time, being moved along with the title from Raw to SmackDown. The other move that made headlines was Jim Ross being moved off the Raw announce team with Jerry Lawler over to the SmackDown brand. Lawler stayed on Raw, but JR was moved over to SmackDown with Mick Foley, who had just started as an announcer on the brand. Michael Cole, in turn, was moved from SmackDown to Raw, which began the Cole era of Monday Night Raw. And the move caught JR by surprise. He was not happy about it, especially after specifically asking Kevin Dunn at the hotel bar the night before if he was being moved. He just went and asked him point blank. And he was told, no. According to JR's book, Under the Black Hat, Dunn told him, "Are you kidding? You think we're stupid enough to break up our Madden and Summerall?" John Madden and Pat Summerall being the most revered broadcast duo in NFL history. Now, is it possible that Kevin Dunn was telling the truth as he knew it to be at that moment, and the decision was made by Vince McMahon at the last minute? It's possible. But it's equally possible he was lying through his fucking teeth. In retrospect, JR knew he fucked up because he had posted a blog leading into the show that week that he did not, in his blog he mentioned that he did not want to move to SmackDown, and he didn't think it would be prudent to waste a draft pick on an announcer. So he pretty much sealed his fate when he said that, because it got back to Vince, and he gave somebody a reason, whoever that person was, it'd be funny if it was Kevin Dunn, to get in Vince's ear and instigate him and say, hey, you should make, look what this guy is saying. We got to make an example out of good old JR. Just to fuck with him. God knows they made a whole fucking career out of doing that. Now, yeah, JR got paid really well for it, but you can come up with a laundry list of examples of all the times the WWE and Vince McMahon fucked with Jim Ross for their own amusement. This was one of those times. So they lied to him. And then they ambushed him live on the air so they could get his genuine reaction to the news. They put a camera right in his face. All he could do is shake his head. You could tell how angry he was. He contemplated quitting. He was up all night until 6 a.m. on the phone with his wife, Jan. He didn't even have another suit to wear for the SmackDown taping the next night. And in the end, he decided not to quit. He said that's not a word that his father taught him. He wasn't going to quit. And he did go to SmackDown. His run lasted into the following year, the following fall, which is longer than Mick Foley lasted at the desk. He survived all of 4 months until he just couldn't take Vince McMahon yelling in his one good ear anymore. This was also the night of the final installment of Vince McMahon's $1 Million Mania gimmick that he was doing at the time, where Vince himself would give away $1 million every week, trying to give the show a ratings boost, which is all this was. It was an attempt to boost the ratings, which didn't even work. Bruce Pritchard claims the money came right out of Vince's personal bank account, because for some reason it couldn't come out of the company. It was, I would say, an entertaining train wreck for the 3 weeks that it lasted. I remember the 1 week where he got rickrolled. It may have actually been the very first week. It might have been the first winner they picked. The guy rickrolled him. And then when he finally answered the phone, Vince didn't hear him because he took forever to say hello and answer the phone. Vince McMahon couldn't hear him and he hung up on the guy. That's $200,000 that guy could have lost. Thankfully for him, Vince called back a second time. He got rickrolled a second time. You know, I say rickrolled. It was one of these things where some people have it set up where when you call them, it can play music first until the person comes to the phone to answer the phone. And the song that this guy chose was Rick Astley, Never Gonna Give You Up. So this was the second time now that this played on Monday Night Raw. Finally, though, the guy answered the phone. By the way, I'm sure Vince McMahon was probably one of the only people in the building that night who didn't even realize what was going on. He probably never even heard of a Rickroll before. You may be listening to this right now and not know what a Rickroll is because it kind of passed years ago, but it used to be a thing. Maybe it still is. I don't know. But the person did get on the phone. He gave the password that you're supposed to give, and he won the money. The new password, by the way, was their brand new catchphrase at that time. WWE Universe. They had just introduced it. They were trying to get that over. Here we are. 14 fucking years later, or 13 years later, whatever it is. Still with the WWE Universe. Can't call them fans. And we can't call them marks, even though we'd love to. So we'll call them the WWE Universe. There was another week where he dialed the person who answered, and he said to Vince McMahon, he goes, "Oh, wrong number." And he hung up on Vince. And then the great Khali, who was out there with Vince, got very upset, and he starts yelling some gibberish into the phone. This was a fucking train wreck. By the way, Vince McMahon dials the phone about as fast as my grandfather does. And he's been dead for 25 years. Anyway, this was the last installment, as I mentioned. He gave away $500,000 to one lucky fan on this final night. And then, all of a sudden, after giving away this money, the stage began to collapse. It began to implode under his feet. And a portion of the McMahon's $1 Million Mania set, this giant sign, this steel sign that they had on the side of the stage, very conveniently tipped over right on top of Vince. Sparks flew. Wrestlers, including Triple H, rushed over like it was a shoot to try to rescue him from under the debris, which really wasn't on top of him. It was kind of like covering him, shielding him. I laughed the entire time at how hokey this all was. But I guess they needed some way to end this silly gimmick. He didn't want to give away any of his money since it wasn't doing anything to really move the ratings. He's like, fuck this, I'm not going to give away money if people aren't watching my show. So this was their way of ending things. Vince kept calling Triple H Paul to make it feel real. Paul, I can't feel my legs, Paul. There was absolutely no follow-up to this, outside of it being a way to write him off television until the following year.